Hi. Welcome to the best junk shop in Boston, the Recycle Store at the Boston Children's Museum. Its barrels are brimming with buttons, baubles, rickrack, and calico, and stuffed with scraps that weren't made into wedding gowns, seat covers, or ping pong balls. You know, it's amazing how one person's trash can be somebody else's treasure, isn't it? All of these bits and pieces could have been tossed out for the garbage trucks, but with a little inspiration, they can be recycled, used again, to create a brand new whole that's a whole lot greater than the sum of its parts. Almost everything you can think of is made up of little bits and pieces of something else. The food you eat, the clothes you wear, the house you live in, maybe even the quilt you tuck under your chin at night. A handmade patchwork quilt is a warm blanket made of small pieces of cloth that are stitched together. It looks a lot like a jigsaw puzzle and can tell a story without using a single word. That's what this book, The Patchwork Quilt, is all about. How a little girl and her family stitched together a swatch of blue, a scrap of red, and a gleam of gold to create a quilt of memories.
The Patchwork Quilt. Story by Valerie Flournoy. Pictures by Jerry Pinkney. Read by Isabel Sanford. Tanya sat restlessly by the kitchen window. She was anxious to go outside and enjoy spring, but she had a cold. "Mama, when can I go outside?" asked Tanya. "In time," Mama murmured, "all in good time." "I'm going to talk to Grandma," Tanya said. Grandma was sitting in her favorite spot. In her lap were scraps of materials of all textures and colors. Tanya recognized them. The plaid was from Papa's old work shirt, and the red scraps were from her brother Ted's shirt. "What you going to do with all that stuff?" Tanya asked. "Stuff? These ain't stuff. These little pieces gonna make me a quilt. A patchwork quilt." "I know what a quilt is. Grandma, there's one on your bed. It's old and dirty." Grandma sighed. "It ain't dirty, honey. It's worn, the way it's supposed to be. My mother made me a quilt when I wasn't any older than you, but sometimes the old ways are forgotten." Mama walked in and looked at the scraps of material that were scattered all over. "I just cleaned this room and now it's a mess." "It's not a mess, Mama," Tanya said. "It's a quilt." "A quilt? You don't need these scraps. I can get you a quilt." Grandma looked at her daughter and then turned to her grandchild. "Yes, your mama can get you a quilt from any department store, but it won't be like my patchwork quilt, and it won't last as long either." Grandma's eyes grew dark and distant. She gazed out the window, absent-mindedly rubbing the pieces of material through her fingers. "Grandma, I'll help you make your quilt," Tanya said. "Thank you, honey. It's going to take quite a while to make this quilt. A good quilt, a masterpiece. It'll take me a year at least." "A year?" shouted Tanya. "I can't wait that long, Grandma." "A year ain't that long, honey. Making this quilt gonna be a joy." One August afternoon, Mama said Tanya's brother Jim's favorite blue corduroy pants were beyond repair. "Bring them here," Grandma said. Grandma took part of the pant leg and cut a few blue squares. Jim watched her add his patches to the others. A quilt won't forget. It can tell your life story. On Halloween, Tanya was an African princess. She danced in the long, flowing robes Mama had made from several yards of colorful material. Grandma cut some squares out and added Tanya to the quilt, too. One day, Tanya leaned over the table to see into the living room. Grandma was telling Mama all about quilts and how this quilt would be very special. From that moment on, both women spent their winter evenings working on the quilt. Only once did Mama put it aside. She wanted to wear something special Christmas night, so she bought some gold material and made a beautiful dress. Tanya knew without asking that the gold scraps would be in the quilt, too. There was much singing and laughing that Christmas. Papa said he had never felt so much happiness in the house. And Mama agreed. The next day, Grandma didn't feel well, and they had to call a doctor. Tanya looked into the living room. The patchwork quilt was folded neatly, just as Grandma had left it. "Can we see Grandma?" Tanya asked. "Not tonight," Papa said. "Grandma needs rest." It was nearly a week before the children were permitted to see their grandmother. "We miss you, Grandma," Ted said. "Your quilt misses you too, Grandma," Tanya said. "My masterpiece," Grandma sighed. "Almost half finished." Tanya walked slowly to where the quilt lay and thought real hard. She knew how to cut the scraps, but she wasn't certain of the rest. Just then, Tanya felt a hand resting on her shoulder. She looked up and saw Mama. "You cut more squares, Tanya, while I stitch some patches together," Mama said. Tanya snipped and trimmed the scraps of material till her hands hurt from the scissors. Every day, Tanya worked on the quilt. But after a few weeks, she stopped. Something was wrong. Something was missing. Finally, she knew. Something wasn't missing. Someone was missing. That evening, before she went to bed, Tanya tiptoed into Grandma's room, a pair of scissors in her hand. She quietly lifted the end of Grandma's old quilt and carefully removed a few squares. February and March came and went. Then one June day, Tanya came home to find Grandma working on the quilt again. "Grandma!" Tanya shouted. "Hush, child. It's almost time to do the quilting on these patches. But first, I have some special finishing touches." "There. It's done," she said. Mama helped Grandma spread the quilt full length. Reds, greens, blues, and golds, light shades and dark, blended in and out throughout the quilt. "It's beautiful," Papa said. He touched the gold patch, looked at Mama, and remembered. Jim remembered, too. There was his blue and the red from Ted's shirt. There was Tanya's Halloween costume, and there was Grandma. Even though her patch was old, it fit right in. They all remembered the past year. They especially remembered Tanya and all her work. So in the right-hand corner of the last row of patches was delicately stitched, "For Tanya, from your Mama and Grandma."
You can't buy a quilt like Tanya's at any store, for any price. And Tanya's Mama and Grandma taught her more than just how to stitch, snip, and sew. They showed her that the secret ingredient in her quilt was love.